Wow, my hair really needs some help, apparently, now that I see me. And it's good to see you guys. We are officially back from vacation, and it's going to be me flying solo tonight to get this kicked off. We're going to do a series on abuse in the culture. And I just want to take a little bit of time to say hello to people as they jump in. I think I need to find out why I cannot see the chat. So I cannot see the chat. My apologies for some reason. This happened to us before, but I cannot. It says no internet. So, goodness. But I see that we're on. I see that two people are viewing. So, for some reason, my chat won't play. I'm going to pull up my phone really quick and see if I can just watch it from there a little bit and perhaps be able to feedback a little bit early on. So, we're over here on Think Differently Academy. By the way, if you guys didn't catch a time this morning on Daystar, consider watching tonight at 8 p.m. Central. Oh, look, there I am on video. Consider watching tonight at 8 p.m. Central. And there I see you guys coming on. Hello, Denise. Hello, Dana. Thanks, by the way, for welcoming us back. Jim is on. So I'm just going to set this here so I can potentially see as people say hello. And hey, Jim. What was I saying? Oh, time on Daystar. My understanding is that episode will air again tonight at 8 p.m. If you want to take a look at that, it's on the book Think Differently, Learn Differently, and specifically ways that we talk about thinking differently or using the brain in new and/or different ways. And so that episode will be tonight, 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. I don't know how you would view Daystar. If you have cable, that's the easiest way. There might be a live internet option. I don't know all the things to tell you. So, but that'll be on tonight at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. I was on there live at 11 o'clock today. And then following that, here we are tonight. So we are back. We took a week off. We also took a week off of our training, as some of you guys know who are in training. Abby, I see you there. And Karen, let's see who else is on. So I'm looking down at my phone because for some reason my chat is not working here. Let me tell you where we're headed for the next couple weeks, and I don't know yet how long. It's been a while since we've talked about abuse here on the Think Differently live Tuesday night class. And I want to take some time over the next couple weeks to talk about it. Of course, there's always the way that we talk about the abuse model that we teach. Hang on, I need a drink. And I think I need to turn this light just a tad. We're always talking about the abuse model. It's been a while since we have, but tonight I want to begin a series like that will be a few weeks long, just talking about the impact of abuse on the culture and how it's woven into culture and how it decays culture as a whole. And so as we'll start tonight just talking about the abuse model that we teach, that in itself we think is a unique perspective on that. We've been told by others in the abuse advocacy world that's been super helpful, and we're constantly contacted by people who have seen our teaching on the abuse model, and out of that have recognized that they're in an abusive relationship, and many of them have found their way to freedom through thinking differently about it. So look, Dana found the link to the live stream on Daystar. I love you guys, how you can find all that stuff. So nice. Hello, Patty. And hello, Deborah. How are you? So in just a minute here, I'll jump into the teaching for tonight, but see if there's anything else to tell you about. Last week, we were in Florida, had a great time with the church there and some of its leaders, and then spent the last half of the week relaxing on the shores of the Gulf. Polly and I spent one particular afternoon just searching up and down and finding shark teeth. It was the coolest thing ever. Both of us are beachcombers, and neither of us have ever in all the many, many years of our lives found a single shark tooth, but both of us that day found enough that I think we left with about 40 or 50 shark teeth in hand or in pocket, however you want to think about that. And so it's totally a blast doing that. Betty is on. Hello, Betty. Amy, how are you doing? Did I see that you recently completed some of your educational stuff? So Amy Carr, have not seen your. If you've been on, I've missed it. So I apologize if I'm making it sound like, where has Amy been? but it's good to see you back on. And all right. Well, in just one more second, and I'll dive into the teaching for tonight. We finished up a series on mental health and faith, ending with last time we were here 2 weeks ago. We talked for 2 weeks, the last 2 weeks, we talked about the Think Differently model and our specific ways of integrating faith and mental health. Tonight, we're going to dive into abuse and the culture surrounding abuse and how abuse really decays the culture that it exists in. It's going to take us a couple weeks to really plow through that. We're going to dive into deeper into some of the specific dynamics in the abuse cycle. We'll talk about things like grooming, and we'll talk about the power differential. We'll talk about what it means to report and how reporting actually tends to work. All those different things are gonna be things. Congrats on the shark teeth. Thank you very much. Eliza's on. Hello, Eliza. How are you? And then Amy says, I'll be done soon. So, congratulations on that. I know you put a lot of work into education. And when you see the finish line, it's incredibly helpful to feel like there's light at the end of the tunnel and whatever other metaphors I can use. So, anyway, one of the things that you'll realize once we begin the teaching, I'm going to stop really having much interaction with you guys. We've discovered it can be really disruptive to the replay. And so, towards the end, I will go through again and look at questions. So, if you guys post questions in the comments, I'll be able to look at the comments and answer a few questions toward the end of our time. But I want to go ahead and get into our topic for the night, because tonight, what I want to do is really go through and give an overview of the Think Differently model of abuse, how we recognize and think about abuse. Again, because I think it's incredibly important to begin to define abuse in the terms we'll talk about tonight, because not only does it help people recognize hidden abuse when it takes place, but it also helps people really think through in a brand new way. How do we know when an abusive person has truly changed? Well, a lot of times, if we're focused on abusive behavior, we may not know the answer to that. And so, for today's purposes, we'll give you a definition and a dynamic, and that will be how we talk about abuse over the next several weeks in this series. You guys good? All right. Well, good to have you all on. And I'm going to start into the conversation. I'm assuming you guys can hear me okay because everybody has been responding online. I just realized my shirt kind of matches the wall. I feel like I'm invisible. Can you see me? Yeah, because my shirt blends right into the wall. Anyway, so abuse. One of the things that I began to realize as both as a counselor and in my personal journey is that abuse is often handled incredibly poorly in systems and cultural settings. And I'm going to submit to you that one of the main reasons why it's handled poorly is because it is seldom recognized for what it truly is. And one of the reasons it's seldom recognized for what it is that most people think of abuse in terms of a set of behavioral patterns instead of the way that we'll define it. And I'm going to say, I think many well intentioned people, as well as people with other motives, but many well intentioned people often get caught up in picking the wrong side in the abuse dynamic. Here's where I want us to begin. Abuse is always a triangle. There's an abuser, there's a victim, and there's a group of onlookers, whether that be counselors and pastors who are actually involved or friends and family who may be looking at what's going on. But in many cases, the onlookers, pastors, coaches, counselors, and those kind of folks miss the real dynamic. And as a result, they end up supporting the wrong person. And also in so doing, they end up persecuting the wrong person. And so I want to talk through how we think about it and ways that it affects the culture, and perhaps then even ways we can recognize it and make a difference. I'm going to make this statement. I think I'm pretty sure of this statement. If we would get the triangle of abuse right, it would disappear overnight. And what I mean by that is part of what happens is that the abuser relies on the support of the onlookers because the dynamic is what it is that we'll explain. And when they get the support of the onlookers, it ends up being the abuser plus another set of people who give them power against the victim, and the victim often ends up being the one who's most persecuted. If we would turn that and the onlookers would recognize what's happening and side with the victim, abuse would go away. The abuser depends on this dynamic for it to be maintained. And it's one of the reasons I'm so committed to spending much of the rest of my life really trying to pull back the curtain on this and shine a light on it. So here's the phrase, and then I want to take some time to like unpack this in a way that will, I think, make some sense for all of us. At the root of abuse, at the root of all forms of abuse, is the misassignment of responsibility. So often we think of abuse in terms of, was it sexual? Was it physical? Was it verbal? Was it emotional? Was it psychological? Was it narcissistic abuse? And all of those forms of abuse have their varying effects. But the key to every one of them, the key to understanding, recognizing, and overcoming every one of them is to begin to redefine abuse not as a set of behaviors, but rather as an inappropriate assignment of responsibility. Now, at first blush, when we talk about an inappropriate assignment of responsibility, it really doesn't sound all that wicked. It doesn't sound that dangerous. It doesn't even sound that harmful. But I want to use the most evident dynamic of sexual abuse as a way to illustrate four steps or four stages of the transfer of responsibility, but also to not just illustrate it, but to show you just how entirely wicked and how devastating this dynamic can be. And so here's what we're after: the abuser assigns responsibility to the abuse victim in multiple layers, multiple levels, in all kinds of ways. And so let me give it to you in terms of an adult sexually abusing a child. The first misassignment of responsibility is the adult who sexually abuses the child makes the child responsible for the adult's drive. Notice I didn't say need, because it is not a need, it's a drive. And when the abuser makes the child responsible to carry the weight of their drive by sexual touching or sexual behavior towards and with a child, they're transferring the responsibility of their drive to that child, who's not designed to carry a number of things, much less to carry the weight of an adult's sexual drive. That's that's assignment of responsibility number one. Assignment of responsibility number two, in many, though not all cases, but this helps illustrate it, the abuser will often tell the victim things like this: I'm only doing this because you're a bad child. I'm only doing this because you're a good child. I'm doing this because you're my favorite. I'm doing this because you're the worst. I'm doing this because you're the best. I'm doing this because you're pretty. I'm doing this because you're ugly. And what's happening is now the abuser is assigning responsibility to the victim for their choice. I'm choosing you because there's something wrong with you. So now the abuser has assigned responsibility for the child to carry the weight of their drive. They've also assigned responsibility for the choice that they're making. I'm doing this to you because of you. By the way, I hope you hear that that's completely inappropriate, wrong, and wicked, but that's the message sent when the adult sexually abuses the child. Misassignment of responsibility number three. Once the abuse has taken place, the abuser, in many, if not all cases, will either overtly or covertly make a threat. If you tell anybody, I am going to A, harm you, B, harm somebody that matters to you. C, if you tell somebody, harm will happen. If you tell somebody, something bad is going to happen. And now the misassignment of responsibility number three, the child ends up carrying responsibility to protect the person who it was actually their responsibility to protect the child. Do you see how much weight has already been put on that child's shoulder? And all they're doing, here's the thing: they've not done anything wrong, but wrong was done to them, but they're carrying the burden of it. Listen, this is going to sound a little weird, but in the last 2 days, I've had two different people do the wrong thing in traffic, but both of them flipped me off and screamed at me for me doing the right thing while they were doing the wrong thing. In other words, I was following the traffic rules, they were violating the traffic rules, and they flipped me off and yelled at me. What you see there is a pretty good snapshot of a significant piece of the abuse dynamic. A child who's been abused like that has done nothing wrong. They're simply doing what they're supposed to as a child. An abuser comes along and in three quick stages loads the emotional weight of all kinds of adult pathology on their shoulders and then walks away free of their burden while this child is burdened and in many cases will carry that burden for years, if not for a lifetime. Now, there's a fourth layer, and that is if that child does what we all tell them to do, you should tell somebody, tell a safe adult, tell a teacher, tell a policeman, find a safe adult and tell them what's happened to you. In many cases, that adult will turn and ask a question like, well, what were you doing? What were you wearing? What was happening that they would do this to you? With either the statement or the implication that somehow this child was actually in some way responsible for what happened to them. Now you've got four assignments of responsibility in a single incident of abuse. And if we look at the emotional transfer, the emotional weight transfer that takes place there, what you'll see is that the inappropriate assignment of responsibility is devastating in the emotional weight that it delivers to the victim. Now, it's so easy to see that in the illustration that I just used, but I want you to recognize that in all the types of abuse that we talk about physical, sexual, psychological, mental, emotional, verbal abuse, all those types of abuse, narcissistic abuse, every single one of them has as a foundation the inappropriate assignment of responsibility where the victim ends up carrying emotional weight that actually belongs to the abuser. Now, here's what I want you to catch. This being the case, the abuse victim, in many cases, doesn't see themselves as an abuse victim. They see themselves as a special helper who has the assignment to help the abuser in some way. And if they could just help them enough, then they would be okay. The spouse of an alcoholic knows that if they could just love them enough, then they would eventually stop drinking. The spouse of a physical abuser knows that if they could just get it right, then he or she would stop being violent with them. The child who's being sexually abused is, often told that, that you're helping me in some way. You're helping me out in some way. And so the child sees themselves as a special helper to the quote unquote needs, even though it's not needs, it's drives of the adult. And again, the abuse victim sees themselves not as a victim of abuse, but rather as a special helper who has a special resource, skill, or capacity that if they could just do enough of it, the abuser would stop and become the wonderful person that they know that they are. The abuser, on the other hand, also doesn't see themselves as an abuser. They see themselves as someone who has no problem or very little problem. And their real problem is this person over here who, if that person would change their behavior, change their actions, in some way give them more of what they need, they wouldn't have outbursts of anger, wouldn't have inappropriate sexual behavior, wouldn't drink, wouldn't drug, wouldn't, et cetera, et cetera. So the abuser, addict, or serial adulterer, as I often say, emotionally and dynamically the same concept. The abuser, the addict, or the emotional or the serial abuser all see themselves as having a small problem or no problem at all. That being the case, what happens then is they see the other person as the problem and they're trying to get them to change so that they will no longer drink, drug, sleep around, do all the things that are the behaviors of the abuser, addict, or serial adulterer. Now, here's the problem then. The onlookers look at this situation and they buy the wrong definition. I used this illustration one time and I'm going to stand by it. I think I've actually used it twice now. Some churches at the end of their services will send a team down front that's available to pray with people. And when people come down for prayer, they'll ask for prayer needs for all kinds of different things. I've been in that setting a number of different times. And people would come to me with this prayer request on a fairly regular basis. My spouse left me last week. I didn't know anything at all was wrong. And now they won't even communicate with me. They're hanging out with people that are bad people that are supporting them against me. They won't even let me talk to them. I didn't even know there was a problem until they left. Will you pray with me that God would, get them to come back to me? Now listen, it's not 100% true, but I'm going to submit to you that in many cases, that prayer request is often the abuser asking for the church to back them up in getting the abuse victim to come back. Why do I say that? Because if the abuse victim sees themselves as a special helper, the last thing they're going to do is speak ill of the person who's abusing them. And if the abuse victim or of the abuser sees the victim as the problem, by the time they come down front to ask for prayer, they're going to ask the people at the front to pray for the person that they perceive to be the problem. Why did they do this to me? They have hurt me by leaving me. In many cases, what they'll say is, I never knew that there was anything wrong. And in so many of those cases, if and when I end up sitting down with both of the people, the abuse victim who left and won't talk to them says, I told them dozens and dozens of times, they just wouldn't listen to me. So what you see is the completion of this triangle. You've got an abuse victim who doesn't see themselves as a victim, but rather sees themselves as a special helper. You've got the abuser who doesn't see themselves as having a problem, except that the victim is their problem. And if the victim would just change, then they would stop having outbursts of anger, stop being sexually inappropriate, stop looking at porn, stop, drinking, drugging, et cetera, et cetera. And so they see the other person as the problem, and somebody else looks in on that, a person praying down at the altar, a pastor, a counselor, and they buy the definition that's presented to them. The abuse victim is not going to speak ill of somebody who they are assigned to help. The abuser is going to speak ill of the person who's carrying the burden of their responsibility because they see them as failing at protecting them. The onlooker, whether counselor, prayer person, pastor, coach, whatever it might be, friend, family member, the onlooker looks at it and says, yep, if only they would feed him more, do more for him or her. If only she would give him more sex, and on and on. The mindset is if the victim would do more, then the abuser would stop abusing and the whole thing would stop. And that's 180 degrees backwards from the truth and where the power to change lies. When the helpers and the onlookers view this backwards, they side with the wrong person and increase one of the key dynamics of abuse, which is the power differential. This is one of the issues that we'll talk about in the weeks ahead. And that is the power differential means that the abuser always has power over the victim. Without the power differential, the abuse couldn't take place because the victim could never simply wouldn't stand for it because they're the person who can make a change. And so what you see then is that when change has to happen, the change necessary is different for each person in the role. If the abuse victim or if the abuser is going to change, what you'll see, the abuser must do more than just stop behaving abusively. The abuser has to accept responsibility, express empathy, and do so over time. In the days ahead, we'll talk more about this. But specifically, I want you to hear that for real change to happen on behalf of the abuser, they've got to take responsibility because they've been giving it away. They've got to express empathy, and they've got to do both of those things over an extended period of time. Here's the tricky part. For the abuse victim to change, they have to stop taking responsibility. And this is another place where the onlookers look at that and go, you must be hard-hearted, you're unforgiving, you're bitter. Why won't you just give in? And in reality, whether instinctively or because a wise counselor has said to them, you must cease taking responsibility from the abusive person. When they stop taking responsibility, it's the only possible change they can make that has any chance of restoring power to both them and to the abuse dynamic. In other words, to take away the power from the person who's had power over them. Let me say it again. For the abuser to change, they must take responsibility, express empathy, and do so over an extended period of time. For the abuse victim to bring change, they have to no longer take responsibility and allow the abuser to take full responsibility for their choices, their behavior, their past, their present, and their future. So when somebody says, hey, I've changed, you have to take me back. I've changed, will you forgive me? Or I've changed, you have to forgive me. Where is the responsibility going when they say that? I've changed, you have to forgive me. Isn't the abuser taking responsibility? Is the abuser still giving responsibility to the one in the victim role? And so, as long as that's still what's happening, you have to forgive me. You have to let me take me back. As long as the abuser is still insisting that the victim respond in a particular way to come back into the abuse dynamic, that's proof that there's been no actual change. Again, if we measure abuse by a behavior, an abusive behavior like yelling, physical violence, sexual mistreatment, all those kind of things, the behavior can change as a part of a cycle. And again, we'll talk about the cycle in the weeks ahead. That's all part of the culture. But so the abuser may stop the behaviors, but will not stop assigning responsibility to the victim. What they'll say is, I've stopped the misbehavior. Now you have to blank. You have to forgive me. You have to come back. You have to, whatever it might be. And that in itself is still a misassignment of responsibility. You can see in that why it is that the abuser has to take responsibility over time to prove that there's real change. If they change their behavior but still continue to put the weight of responsibility on the victim, nothing has changed. Let me say it again. Nothing has changed. If the behavior has changed but the responsibility is still being transferred, it's simply part of a larger cycle that continues around and around. And that's not real change. That's simply stations on the cycle. And so when I say nothing has changed, you might say, but the behavior has changed, to which I would say, which is all part of a cycle that never stops until the abuser takes full responsibility for their choices, their behavior, the impact they've made on other people, hence the empathy part of it. Listen, abuse is an insidious dynamic. And when we, as counselors, coaches, pastors, helpers, friends, family, and onlookers, don't recognize what's really going on in front of us, we often lend the weight of our support to the abuser at the extreme cost of the abuse victim. One of the things we'll talk about in the weeks ahead is what does it actually mean for an abuse victim to come forward and take a stand, like I said, for them to actually stop taking responsibility and stand up against what's going on. The price that an abuse victim pays is incredibly high. And all the people who say that they've got motives for doing that besides just getting safe and getting out of the dynamic obviously have no understanding of the price paid by an abuse victim when they take a stand in their dynamic and are no longer willing to take responsibility. I'm going to take a look at questions real quick. We've got weeks ahead of us to kind of let all the stuff be unpacked, but I want you to hear that triangle first, because that triangle, at the root of that, a misassignment of responsibility, it forms that triangle. And when that triangle continues to back up the wrong person and oppose the wrong person, abuse always has the freedom to operate in a culture that doesn't recognize and respond appropriately to abuse. So let's take a look and see if there are questions. Amy, I see your comment. It costs you almost everything. I know. So painful. Deanne, thank you for the time spent to formulate this definition that unlocks shackles. We get word all the time from people who have been helped by this. Beth, please put this in a book. Catherine, thanks for saying this. Victims who stand up and take a stand are courageous. Put on Twitter just the other day that, people who think that the victim position is one of weakness don't realize that in every single time a victim stands up, they are the strongest person in the dynamic, because they're the ones who are willing to endure the loss that they know is coming in order to gain back the power that's been taken from them in the abuse dynamic. Joyce, inappropriate assignment of responsibility. I found a picture of myself at the age. Some things had happened to me when I saw that little girl. Suddenly the light came on. I let that responsibility for the situation go. Good for you, Joyce. I'm proud of you. Again, that's what happens for every victim who stands up, is they realize there are things that I was told I was responsible for that I'm not. Now, we all have to be responsible for what we are responsible for. But we're taking responsibility for someone else weakens everybody involved. So wish I could shout this teaching from the rooftops. Me too, Beth. Jen, bingo. Jen, hi from Houston. Thank you for your wisdom and teachings. Such a breath of fresh air. Jen, we want to spread this as far as we can. I really believe that if people began to understand this is the dynamic that we're up against, people would stop supporting the wrong person and begin to support the right person. Now, I know there's some exceptions to that, but I just want to say that I think on the larger scale, and what I mean by the larger scale is the cultural the cultural support that far too often is given to abusers and withdrawn from abuse victims, if we could just reverse that one thing, the power differential would change and everybody would, the culture could shift. So one of the reasons that I want to do this about the culture over the next several weeks is just to recognize that abuse doesn't just harm the victim. The entire culture in which abuse takes place is eroded. The fabric and integrity of the culture is eroded when abuse is happening and when it's addressed in the wrong way. And by the wrong way, I mean when the abuser is supported and the abuse victim is given emotional weight. When a counselor, coach, pastor, or helper, or family member or friend says to the abuse victim, hey, you know, how hard would it be for you to just go back and give a little bit more? They don't realize that they're actually assigning the very dynamic that is abuse. For that person, the victim, to take responsibility and go back and quote unquote give a little bit more is simply feeding the beast that they've decided to starve to death. The beast assumes that this last dynamic. So you've got the abuse victim has a resource. They've got either their body, they've got emotional stamina, they've got finances, they've got some resource that the abuser wants. The abuser has deficit. It can be, they have a drive that they want to fulfill. It can be an emotional deficit. It can be a financial deficit. And so the abuser has minuses. The abuse victim has pluses. And what happens is the abuser says, I demand that you give me your pluses, and I demand that you carry my minuses. And that exchange of plus minus goes on and on and on, while the victim becomes depleted emotionally. And by the way, the abuser doesn't gain strength from getting pluses from the other person, because legitimately you can't gain emotional strength from another person. Emotional strength is like physical strength. I cannot work out and you get stronger because of my effort. Emotional strength comes from the development of my own emotional strength. I can't give you mine. We can lean on each other, but in terms of long term emotional resource, each person must develop their own emotional resource in the same way each person must develop their own physical capacity. I can't lift weights and have you get stronger, and I can't do cardio and have you develop higher capacity. My exercise benefits me, and my emotional work benefits me. Again, I can support another person, but I can't give someone else emotional resource. When the abuser is demanding emotional resource, both people are weakened by that because the abuse victim can give away their resource, but they get in return what they get is deficit. The abuser then doesn't receive strengthening from that. It becomes a bottomless pit of demanding more and demanding more until both people are increasingly weakened by the process. And eventually what happens is the abuse victim gets to a point where they know they can't keep going any longer. When they get to the point where they can't keep going any longer, we'll talk about this in the weeks ahead, but when they get to that point where they can't keep going any longer, both the most important and in some cases the most dangerous time arrives, and that is when the abuse victim decides they're done. When the abuse is physical, when it's violence, and an abuse victim decides they're done, that's often the time when most abusers become the most violent, and it's often the time if a murder occurs, that would be the time it occurs when the abuse victim decides they're going to get out. If you're in a situation of physical abuse and you're hearing this teaching and trying to figure out how to get out, please get professional help from seasoned abuse advocates and counselors. Before you just leave, be sure that you get help from people who understand what it means to get out of a physically violent relationship. It can be the most dangerous time because now you're going to take back your resource and the other person's desperation increases. But here's the thing we're after. When the abuse victim finally begins to realize, I'm taking responsibility for them and I'm going to take it back because I can only be responsible for me. Now, change really can begin. In the weeks ahead, we'll talk not only more about how change can begin, but we'll talk about all the different, more subtle dynamics that take place in the culture around this cycle. We'll talk about the cycle itself, and then we'll talk about the impact it has on the culture. So, guys, thanks for joining me. We've got weeks to talk about this. Come back next Tuesday night, 6 p.m. Central. By the way, if you're new to us and you're on YouTube, go down and click the like and subscribe button. If you're on Facebook, go ahead and like the Facebook page. And by the way, if you're watching us on Think Differently Academy, yay, we're glad that that's still working. We started out the year saying that we would move exclusively to TD Acad for these broadcasts, but we're still working out so many bugs for that. So in the meantime, if you don't know who Think Differently Academy is, usually Polly's sitting right here by my side. And I'm Bob Hamp. My wife Polly and I are Think Differently Academy, and we teach on all elements of finding freedom in your life. And this next several weeks, we're going to focus on finding freedom from abuse. So we'll talk to you guys soon. Bye bye.